very delighted to have the opportunity to invite members of the Charlotte Chamber of Commerce, public policy officials here to, again, hear from one of the major policy makers, in this case from Washington, D.C. And some of you know that we welcome these opportunities, whether it's leaders from Raleigh or from Washington. And extremely pleased to have with us today the chair of the Federal Communications Commission. Bear with me for just a couple seconds on the official bio, then we'll get into the conversation and maybe have a little fun. So, Ajit Pai, I pronounced that correct?
I've been called worse.
He's been called worse. Graduated with honors from Harvard University in 1994 and from the University of Chicago Law School in 1997, where he was an editor of the University of Chicago Law Review and won the Thomas R. Mulroy Prize. In 2010, he was one of 55 individuals nationwide chosen for the 2011 Marshall Memorial Fellowship, a leadership development initiative of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. We've actually had a former colleague from the Chamber and others in our community go through that program. He's here today, of course, after a very distinguished legal career and in appointed government positions, here with us today in his role as chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. He was designated as chairman by President Trump in January of 2017. He had previously served as a commissioner at the FCC, appointed by then-President Barack Obama, after which he was confirmed unanimously by the United States Senate in May 2012. And so we welcome you here for this conversation. And two additional reference points to his bio. You need to know he has won a singing contest on the Jenny Jones Show, and I'll let him decide whether he wants to share more of that. But more importantly, when asked, who is the most famous person you have ever met, without hesitation, he said, Judge Judy. And we've got to hear, appointed by presidents and runs in pretty high circles. Tell us about Judge Judy.
She presides over the highest court in the land, as I always say. She's fantastic. My mom and I, in particular, have loved the show for over 20 years. And I remember calling my parents after I got the news that President Obama was going to be signing my nomination papers, and I was so excited. This is Halloween night of 2011. I call home, and my mom's first three questions right out of the box were, does the job pay? Is this a full-time position? And if it doesn't work out, can you go back to the law firm where you were? And so she never understood that this FCC thing is actually kind of somewhat of a big deal. But when she finally recognized, okay, my son has come over the hump, a few years ago I was in Los Angeles and ended up arranging a meeting with Judge Judy and the bailiff Bird, for those of you who watch, and the rest of the court. This is and I told my parents on a Friday I was going to meet the judge on a Monday. My mom canceled her patience for Monday. She came to Los Angeles to meet with me, and finally got to meet the judge in chambers, and afterward she raved to all of her friends, my son got me in to see Judge Judy. It's like that's what she was most proud of. It's like incredible stuff. But yeah, the Jenny Jones thing was great too. I used to live in Chicago, as you pointed out, and my law school roommate and I used to go to the Jenny Jones show just to pass the time. And before the show started, typically they would have a singing contest to warm up the crowd. And so one of the times they asked for volunteers. These two women volunteered, and they usually had three, and no one was raising hands. So I said, hey, this is before the internet really took off, so it's never going to live on YouTube, right? Right? I hope so. So I volunteered, and the first woman sang this Mariah Carey song, beautiful voice. The second one also sang a song, and I thought, you know what? I'm just going to go for it. And so I started singing Respect by Aretha Franklin in falsetto. And at first the crowd was somewhat taken aback. It was kind of an unusual thing to hear. By the end of it, they really got into it, and so the producer of the show, who would typically give an award to the winner of this contest by giving them a T-shirt, they would usually poll the audience to see by applause who was the best singer. This time, he didn't even bother polling him. He just handed it to me, high-fived me, and I was on my way. And so it's kind of been downhill since 1996, since I won that contest, but nonetheless, it was one of the things I really cherish about my time in Chicago. I know we got off track here with the
I have Judge 3 Judy pages of questions here, none of which will be nearly as intriguing as that one. But in all seriousness, you are on a tour of the country. You spent yesterday in the Triangle of North Carolina. You're out to talk about your priorities as chairman. We'd love to hear those.
Absolutely. I love being on the road. That's one of the best things about the job is getting to see parts of the country and to meet people who are impacted by our decisions. And this week alone, I've started off in Richmond, where I visited VCU, and Saw some of the things they're doing in terms of telemedicine to connect folks in rural communities who might not otherwise see a specialist. They can now visit with VCU's physicians remotely, and whether it's a preoperative assessment or a postoperative monitoring, they are improving health outcomes in some of these small towns where medical care, unfortunately, isn't what it should be. Then went to Charles City, Virginia, where I got to visit a farm. Farmer Dave Hula, who is the current world record holder for corn yield, 542 bushels per acre. Part of the reason why he's able to do that is broadband. Wireless connectivity, cellular and GPS, allows them to do all kinds of stuff that improves their yield. Then, as you pointed out, I was in Raleigh yesterday. Had a meeting with some roundtable with some business leaders, and then visited in Graham, North Carolina, with the last classroom in the entire state of North Carolina to be connected with internet. And it's just a tremendous accomplishment that everyone in this room who is from North Carolina should take pride in. As a Kansan, I'm envious. It's, not only did you take Roy Williams, now you've taken the crown for connectivity in terms of the classrooms. But it's a tremendous accomplishment that wouldn't happen but for the leadership of folks in this room and in the state of North Carolina. So it's really invigorating to be here. It's I came here a lot ahead of cousins and aunts and uncles who lived here for a long time. I remember Charlotte and the surrounding communities in the 80s and 90s, and to see how quickly things are moving, the energy in this town, in this county, it's a testament to the leadership on all kinds of levels, public and private sectors.
So we enjoy a remarkably diverse economy. Yeah. Two industries, banking, we're the third largest financial center in the country. Banking brings more wealth into our economy than any other. Healthcare is the largest employer with about 90,000 employees. How does the work of the FCC relate to those two industries in particular? You've mentioned healthcare already.
Yeah, so I think we provide the connectivity that allows some of those technologies to really take off. And healthcare is a paradigmatic example of that. We have something called the Rural Healthcare Program, which essentially gives a discount to healthcare providers for the internet connections that they want to have. And the impact of this is tremendous. I mean, I mentioned VCU, but I'll just give you another vignette. 3 weeks ago, I was in Scottsville, Kentucky, which is a part of Allen County, about 40,000 or so residents in Allen County, lower income part of Kentucky. In the entire county of Allen, there's not a single pediatrician. And so if you're a child who gets sick in an Allen County school before last year, you didn't really have any good options. But now, thanks to a high-speed connection between the Allen County schools and Vanderbilt University's Children's Hospital Center, they are able to take advantage of telemedicine in a way they never could before. And just think about what that means. I mean, obviously, the child who is sick can get better, can get diagnosed quickly. The parents don't have to take time off work. They can use an app to remotely monitor how this hospital visit goes. Teachers can focus on teaching. I mean, everybody's just better off. And if you multiply that out across all the different communities in this country, it's a tremendous improvement in our standard of living. And not to mention, it could potentially save lives. So we're really pioneering much more in terms of telemedicine. This past Monday, for those of you who are bored, you can read the op-ed that I wrote along with President Kennedy's first FCC chairman, Newt Minow. And we're talking about the power of telemedicine to really transform these communities. It requires a combination of connectivity and cutting-edge medical practices, and I think we're just scratching the surface in terms of telemedicine. FinTech, too, I'm really excited about where things are going. It's just a struggle to, frankly, keep up with all the developments, and I find myself spending a lot of time over the last year studying things like blockchain and different distributed ledger technology and whatnot. I think there, too, connectivity could have a place in improving how these technologies are pursued. And the more general regulatory vision I try to enunciate, even if it doesn't strictly relate to the FCC, is a more market-based approach to allow some of these technologies to develop. I know Bitcoin, of course, has a tremendous amount of publicity, but I think new technologies like blockchain generally are going to be transformative, and I think that we should really allow them to develop. And
so cryptocurrency and blockchain, does the FCC have a role?
We don't necessarily, but I have talked to my counterparts at the CFTC, at the SEC, about exploring these issues in further detail, because they are, of course, struggling with these. How do you fit these new technologies into the old paradigms of what is the security and that sort of stuff? And so I think there are some opportunities for collaboration there that we're exploring.
Great, great. Let's just shift gears a bit. We worked as a Chamber of Commerce with the telecom industry, our legislature, a few years ago to provide the regulatory framework for 5G, and there's now a race for 5G. What is the role of the FCC and then North Carolina? How would you rate North Carolina in terms of that race relative to other states?
I think I'll start with the last question first. I think North Carolina is very forward-thinking. I think the recent legislation you passed will help ensure that this state is at the forefront of some of the 5G innovation. For our part, on the federal level, we have two basic missions, or issue areas, I guess you might say. One is spectrum, the airwaves through which the wireless traffic goes, and the other is infrastructure, the networks, the physical networks that are necessary to carry this traffic. And we've been pretty aggressive on both. We've tried to free up as much spectrum as we can for the 5G revolution, licensed and unlicensed, everything from cell companies using this spectrum to provide high-speed connectivity to the next generation of Wi-Fi or whatever the next unlicensed technology is that we can't even foresee. On the infrastructure side, too, we've tried to streamline the rules. 5G networks of the future are going to look very different from 4G. Instead of massive cell towers that dot the landscape occasionally, you'll see hundreds, if not thousands, of small cells, smaller infrastructure, largely inconspicuous, operating at lower power. We think that these small cells shouldn't be subjected to the same levels of regulatory review that apply to a big cell tower. And so working collaboratively and largely in a bipartisan way, we've been able to streamline some of the rules to exempt some of these small cells from environmental, historic preservation reviews, and working collaboratively with state and local governments to see if we can make sure that all of our citizens, regardless of where they happen to live, are able to benefit from the mobile revolution.
So picking up on that theme, we have a vigorous conversation and a lot of activity around upward mobility and economic mobility, and how do we move the needle in trying to reduce the concentrated multi-generational poverty that we see in certain geographies of our city. Our city will have bonds on the ballot this fall for the third time this decade for housing, transportation, and neighborhoods. But the digital divide is one of the issues that affects mobility. What can the FCC do, and what can you encourage us to do to address that digital divide in a bigger way?
That's a great question. On my first full day of chairman, January 24th of 2017, I gave a speech to the FCC's employees in which I said, we have so many important issues on our plate. To me, though, there's none that is more important than the digital divide, the gap between those who have access to the internet and next generation technologies and those who don't. And part of the reason why I think that is that I've been to some of the places that are on the wrong side of the digital divide. Cape and Springs, West Virginia, Mission, South Dakota, Navajo Nation in Arizona, and many, many other towns that will never make the front pages of the newspapers, but nonetheless, there are thousands or millions of Americans who want access to the internet to be able to start a job, start a business, create jobs, educate their kids, do telemedicine or precision agriculture, whatever it is, but they're not able to do that. And so we've tried to create a sense of mission at the FCC, along with other federal agencies, to tackle this issue. And I think it's extremely important for us to pull out all of the stops, whether it's federal subsidies, reforming those subsidies to target unserved areas, which we're doing, or modernizing our rules to encourage private sector companies to lay the fiber and otherwise build the connections that are necessary, which is what we're doing, or just visiting some of the places like Mecklenburg County or Charlotte that are very forward-thinking. I just came, actually, part of the reason why I'm late, for which I apologize, we were visiting Black Tech, an African-American woman-led incubator. It's focusing on closing that mobility gap. As I understand it, Charlotte ranks something like 50th out of the 50 markets studied in terms of upward mobility. So if you're born in the lowest quartile, I think it is, of the social strata, you don't have as much of an ability to take charge of your future. And one of the great things about the internet age, I think, is that if you give people the tools, they will succeed. I mean, everybody wants an opportunity to succeed, and that's part of what Black Tech is doing, part of what the mayor is seeking to do, and part of what the FCC is trying to do, too, is just empower people with the tools that are necessary to succeed in the digital era. I don't know what the next great idea is, or what the next great business is going to be, but every American, regardless of who he or she live, regardless of what you look like, regardless of your family background, all of us should have a chance to succeed. And closing the digital divide, I think, sets the table for doing that.
Great. Totally different direction. You have a meeting of the FCC on June the 7th. You have a very full agenda. Tell us about the business of the FCC and your job as the chairman.
Oh, my gosh. So, yeah, it's not an easy job, I'll say that. I spent 4.5 years as a commissioner, and I thought, oh, man, this chairman thing, it's not, how hard could that be? It's hard, it's really hard. So part of the great thing about being a commissioner before becoming chairman is that you become familiar with all the issues, but there's really no substitute for being in that office. You get to set the agenda for the agency. Every month by law we are required to have a meeting where we vote on different things that the chairman proposes, and we've been very aggressive over the last 1.5 years in teeing up a bunch of different things that we think are going to advance the ball in terms of what I call digital opportunity. This month alone, as you point out, or in a few weeks, I should say, next month, We're going to be voting on a number of different things. For example, 5G, which we were just talking about. Clearing out some of the underbrush to make sure that the first 5G spectrum auctions, which we'll hold in November, can be held smoothly. Another thing we're working on is internet protocol-based telephone service for people with disabilities. This is one of the services that we want to upgrade to allow those who are hard of hearing or deaf to be able to access the same IP-based technologies that those of us who are hearing often take for granted. A number of different things that we're doing, but it's a challenge, but I love it because I really care about these issues, and the overall theme, regardless of the area, media, wireless, satellite, you name it, is making sure that we modernize our rules to empower Americans to have digital opportunity every single month. When we're trying to think about what's going to come down the pike, that's what I ask our staff to look at, and it's been a pretty active time, to say the least.
So, and you've been active. I understand this is now 25 states that you have been to.
Including the territories of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands on top of that.
Wow, wow. And you're communicating, obviously, the work of the FCC, but what are the things you're learning from the locals that you would encourage us to be aware of it from a best practices perspective?
There's so many things. It's hard to even think of a single example, but I'll use yesterday as a simple vignette. I was at Graham High School, as I mentioned, and getting to see Mr. Riggs talk about how broadband enabled him to teach his students about biology in a way that was unthinkable when I was in school. I mean, when I was in school, the cutting-edge technology was the number 2 pencil, filling out the bubbles, make sure you don't go beyond. Now it's completely different. It's really incredible to hear, and it just reinforces to me the importance of making sure that every school, not just the schools in North Carolina, are connected. That's really important. Later on in the day, I visited Randolph Telephone, a small company in Morris, North Carolina, that's providing connectivity. And they relayed to me the story of a girl named Arden, who was a teenager who was struggling to do her homework at school. And she wrote an essay in which she said one time they actually drove to Asheboro, stayed in a hotel room, simply so they could have internet access that was reliable for a single night, just to know what that felt like. To me, that reinforced the importance of us updating our rules on the rural broadband programs that we have to make sure that we get connectivity into rural parts of the country. I mean, if you look at every single hamlet, city, town, whatever, you're going to find these stories out there. And I know I'm biased because I work at the FCC, but I truly believe that the internet is such a transformative force. Virtually every single sector is being changed by it. We talked about fintech and healthcare and all the rest, education. But it all comes down to the internet, and so to learn about those stories, to learn about some of the benefits from it and some of the challenges, and then to relay those stories to us is extremely valuable. It's part of the reason why I get on the road and I go in these rental cars to small towns that are off the beaten path. Part of it is that I grew up in a small town in rural Kansas, so I love just getting on the road and meeting people. But part of it is to just inform myself. It's easy I could spend 24 hours a day sitting in the office looking at paper, typing out things on my computer. There's no substitute to me, though, to getting out there and to seeing what the challenges are in places like Utuado, Puerto Rico, where I've been, and even my hometown, which I visited as a chairman.
Yeah. Restoring Internet Freedom Order. Gotten a lot of attention lately.
So I hear, judging from my Twitter feed, I think that's right.
What do we need to know about that?
I think the bottom line thing that people need to know is that we favor a free and open internet. All of us do. I mean, to me at least, the internet is the greatest free market innovation in history. And part of the reason is that President Clinton made a very critical decision in 1996 at the dawn of the commercial internet. He and a Republican Congress agreed cooperatively that they would not subject this new technology to the heavy-handed utility-style rules that were developed in 1934 to regulate Ma Bell, the telephone monopoly. And to me, the results of that decision speak for themselves. $1.5 trillion in network investment, startups that like Facebook and Amazon and Google that went from small companies to global powerhouses, and consumers were ultimately the beneficiaries of all of these technologies. I mean, now it's easy to forget because we live in the day-to-day, but if you'd gone back 20 years and you said, here's a little device, you're going to use this not just to make phone calls. I mean, phone calls are going to be the last thing you'll use. You'll use it to make restaurant reservations and buy airline tickets and monitor your mom's healthcare appointments and see how your kids are doing in school. I mean, this platform wouldn't exist but for the fact that we have this kind of market-based innovation. And so I understand reasonable minds can disagree, but our thinking is that going forward, as we expand into the next generation of the internet, we're going to need massive amounts of investment in infrastructure, huge amounts of innovation on the edge of content companies. And so we want to create a more market-based environment in which any company of any kind can succeed. And we're hopeful that past this prologue, the success we saw from 1996 until 2015, will progress into the future. And to guard against any kind of anti-competitive behavior, we've instituted an FCC transparency rule backed up by Federal Trade Commission enforcement, and the new chairman of the FTC has said that they are going to take targeted action against any company that engages in anti-competitive conduct. So we want to make sure consumers are protected. We have a free and open internet. We have infrastructure investment across the country, and that's ultimately something I think will be good for everybody's online experience.
Great. We're going to open this up in just a second for questions from the audience, but I skipped over parts of your resume and what you did.
Thank you for that.
Before joining the FCC, but how does one find his way to the FCC?
I often joke that I feel like the Forrest Gump of Washington. I just ambled from job to job. Next thing you know, it's like, wow, gosh, I'm in this quarter office. How did this happen? But I came to D.C. 20 years ago to work at the Justice Department, having worked for a judge in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I was at they put me in the telecom section, and I always loved antitrust law, but I found, much to my surprise, I really loved the technology, learning how it works and understanding things like optical fiber networks and broadcast and all the rest. And so then just found an interesting job always around the corner. I worked on the Capitol Hill for a few years and got a sense of what it was like to be in the political world. I did that because, I don't know if you guys have seen Schoolhouse Rock way back when. Like, I'm just a Bill, just a little old Bill. And I was like, wow, I'm living here in D.C. I've never worked on Capitol Hill. I've got to change that. So I went up there and then went to the FCC as a lawyer in 2007, worked there for about 4 years and got a bird's eye view on some of the great issues of the day. And then went to a law firm, and on the first day I was working at the firm, got a call, hey, there's going to be an opening at the FCC. Would you be interested in interviewing for the position? And so I feel just incredibly blessed. Every time I go back to my hometown, I visit with my elementary school, with my high school, and my message to them is never let who you are or where you're from limit your horizons. I never would have predicted 30 years ago, when I was a dorky, shy kid in the small town of Parsons, Kansas, that I'd have a chance to serve in this capacity. But I would have wanted to believe it, and I want the next generation of kids in Parsons and everywhere to believe that it's possible for them too. It's a testament not to my credentials, but just to the power of the American dream.
So appointed by President Obama.
Yeah.
And then appointed chairman by President Trump. Not a lot of precedent for that.
Yeah, kind of an interesting combination of the two, I suppose.
Your relationship with the president, and what is the difference in their styles from your role?
So I actually I remember seeing President Obama, who was then a lecturer at the University of Chicago Law School. He was a young Harvard Law graduate and was teaching law students there. And of course, had I known he was going to be the President of the United States, I would have made a much stronger effort to say hi to him and whatnot. But yeah, and I got to know him a little bit in the Senate too. I remember he and I were alone on the subway that connects the office buildings to the Senate floor, and we had a chance to chat about all kinds of stuff. And just very down to earth, pleasant, and the current president as well. Had a chance to meet him a couple times, and the same. They've each, of course, been very helpful to me in terms of giving me this opportunity to serve. And the FCC is an independent agency, which is different from the typical cabinet departments. So once the president picks you and the Senate confirms you, you're kind of on your own. And so we've operated just as an independent agency over the last year and a half. We make our decisions, we defend them in court, we defend them in Congress at oversight hearings and the like, and we're kind of off to the races. And
Any openings coming up for folks in the audience who might be interested?
I mean, I'm there for a little while, but if you guys, if you're all interested, let me know. It's really worth it, though. It's really, I mean, like I said, it was an accident that I ended up in this position. Wouldn't have predicted it when I moved to D.C. 20 years ago. But if you care about these issues, there's no better place to be. And public service, generally, I think, a lot of folks, when you travel around, have this vision of, federal workers or you're a government worker. And to me, there's no higher calling. I mean, when I drive across the bridge from Virginia into D.C. and I see the Washington Monument and the Congress, and I come to the FCC building, I mean, I know it sounds cheesy, and it probably is, but it really makes me happy to know that I'm playing a small part in making things better across the country. I get a chance to meet people I would never otherwise meet if I were in the private sector, and hear their stories and try to make the world a better place. It just gets me up in the morning, along with that big Reese's cup of coffee that I drink every day.
Reese's cup.
Yeah, so if you Google it, well, Google the right things, but if you Google my name in Reese's mug, I think you'll see what I'm talking about.
Your enthusiasm is impressive. I commend you for that.
Coffee and adrenaline, I guess.
Questions from the audience of the chairman? Yes, sir.
Oh, yes. Well, first and foremost, congratulations on all the connectivity that you've been able to establish. I mean, in Mecklenburg, across the state, it's a challenge, so you deserve a lot of credit for that. To me, E-rate is one of the great success stories of the FCC, created a little over 2 decades ago. And to see the power of the program has just been tremendous. So right now, we're trying to make it more user-friendly. Epic, as you probably know, is a portal that wasn't working as well as we wanted when I got into office. So I asked the company that oversees Epic and the other online portals for us to try to make it easier to use so that you're not stuck in this purgatory where you're trying to submit paperwork by the deadline and, oh, the submit button doesn't work, or you don't want to get stuck into an appeals process that could take years to resolve. So we're trying to make sure that that works as properly as possible. In the long term, we want to give, ultimately, more flexibility to the schools and libraries who use this program. I gave a speech several years ago, about 5 years ago, I think it was, where I outlined my vision. And the ultimate, at a very high level, the goal is to empower you to make the decisions that are right for your students and your library patrons. We don't know from Washington, okay, in year 1 you need fiber connection to this particular school. In year 3 you might need Wi-Fi routers or caching servers. We think it's easier to let you make that decision, to distribute the funding in a streamlined way, and then you can do what you think is best, and ultimately have more accountability on the back end to be able to post those results so that everybody can learn from the best practices in Mecklenburg County. That, I think, ultimately is where we'd like to go, and hopefully we can do that at some point.
Larkin?
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah. I personally don't think they were very fair. I mean, they didn't really focus on substance, as you might have seen. It was more of the personal attacks. And look, I get that. I mean, I'm a public official. People can and do take shots all the time, some fair, some not. But I think ultimately what I would like folks to recognize is that these networks don't have to exist. Internet access doesn't have to be invested in. Capital doesn't have to be raised, risks don't have to be taken. And so the more heavily you regulate something, the less likely it is that companies are going to be able to build a business case for installing the infrastructure that will empower people in small towns and big cities alike. And so I think our goal here is the same. As I said, we all want a free and open internet. We just need to have a regulatory framework that is best calibrated to ensure openness of the internet and a massive incentive to invest in next generation networks. And 5G is a good example of that. 5G doesn't have to exist in the United States. Other countries saw the success that we had in 4G, China, South Korea, and Japan in particular, and they're trying to create a haven for investment so that they can claim the success for themselves that we had in 4G. And so if we heavily regulate 5G infrastructure and the operation of those networks, we could easily see other countries taking the lead. So at the end of the day, like I said, we have many, many things that divide us in this country. We have Yanny versus Laurel, Carolina versus Duke. I mean, this should not be one of them. I mean, I think the internet is one of the things we can all agree is just such a success story. We want that to continue. And I understand it's it's less sexy for me to say, well, we thought the Title I classification as an information service was superior to Title II classification as a telecom service. Much easier to say, Ajit is destroying the internet, and I understand the visceral appeal of that, but it's just not true. And so the facts at the end of the day, I think, are going to speak for themselves. We're going to see better, faster, cheaper internet access as a result of our decision.
Back here and then Tarkle.
Hi. Yeah. That's a great question. From our perspective, our role in that regard would be more bully pulpit than regulation. Our E-rate program, as you might know, extends primarily to the connections or the connectivity for schools as opposed to the hardware that is used to take advantage of that connectivity. That said, though, we do try to highlight some of the companies that have done forward-thinking things. I did a visit in Baton Rouge about a year and a half ago where some of the companies had donated equipment to make sure that it wasn't just high-speed internet to the school, but students could actually use it in the classrooms. And that's very forward-thinking, I think, of a lot of these companies. They recognize that to have the workforce of the future, we need to make sure that students of today are able to have facility with some of these devices. You can't just start cold after you finish school and you expect to be a productive worker in the technology sector in the future. So we are always happy to partner with groups like yours if there's a way to move the ball in terms of some of the hardware. Thanks. I think the first and foremost thing they should be thinking about is making sure that the infrastructure is in place for their products and services to be distributed ubiquitously. I mean, I think it disserves a lot of those companies that rely on networks if the networks don't exist at all or if they are subpar. And I think part of the reason why we made our decision was looking historically at these regulations. Europe, which has had utility-style regulations on the internet, has something like 50% less capital expenditure. Their online experience is far slower, far worse, much less penetration than you would get in the United States, even though we're comparably sized. And so going forward, we want to make sure that we have a market-based approach to encourage as much infrastructure investment as possible. But again, to guard against any anti-competitive behavior, that's part of the reason why we didn't wipe the slate clean. We said we want to have transparency at the front end, so every single internet service provider has to disclose their business practices. And on the back end, the Federal Trade Commission can take targeted action against any company that behaves in an anti-competitive way. They have very broad authority under Section 5 of the FTC Act against what is called an unfair or deceptive trade practice. And that would include a company that's discriminating against a fintech startup, for example, that is engaging in high bandwidth activities and the like. So I think going forward, the startups should have confidence that they'll be able to innovate consistently with their business plan and be able to thrive. And moreover, as the infrastructure scales, hopefully their companies will be able to scale along with them.
Questions from this side of the room? Dan Rosselli, I would have been disappointed had you not raised your hand.
Yeah. Yeah. I think obviously a market failure, anti-competitive behavior in the marketplace, or companies that weren't able to thrive as a result, and infrastructure investment slowing over the next year or two. I mean, those are the kinds of things that we wouldn't want to see. And as I said, I think PASS is going to be prologue. We had the same regulatory framework from 1996 until 2015. We saw a steady uptick in infrastructure investment and innovation among companies all across all of these different sectors. And so I think going forward, that light touch approach is going to serve us very well. And again, if not, we do have cops on the beat, both at the FCC and the FTC. All of us succeed when the internet economy succeeds. And I think that's the goal going forward. Thank you. Hi. I mean, I certainly hope we set our sights higher than Pokemon Go. Nothing against, I mean, having people wander around aimlessly in Washington, right into traffic, looking for that, that was a surreal couple of days or weeks, I have to say. But to be frank, I don't know. I mean, that's part of the excitement about it, is that we don't know what the next high bandwidth or low bandwidth application will be. I'll highlight some of the ones that we all know about that I think are very interesting. From a city perspective or county perspective, I think smart cities is extremely interesting to me. For example, if you had low bandwidth 5G sensors in every single light pole, and you could monitor, okay, between the hours of 10 p.m. and 6 a.m., there's literally no foot traffic here, so do we really need to have the lights on? That could save a tremendous amount of power and money, and if you aggregate that across the entire country, you'd see tremendous savings from that. Industrial IoT is something I think is very interesting. I met long ago with a company that's installing some of these sensors, and one of its clients is Chobani, the yogurt company. And they said that for Chobani, when you're shipping your yogurt across the country, it's very critical to make sure that the temperature in the back of the truck doesn't go above a certain level. And so these sensors allow this company and Chobani ultimately to monitor in real time every single truck, every single box of yogurt to make sure that they can have quality assurance by the time it arrives. And that's something that's very important to all the yogurt aficionados out there, of course. In terms of high bandwidth applications, I think the sky is the limit. I was at Facebook not long ago, and I got to see one of their Oculus demonstrations, and it was more of a gaming type of environment, but just the notion of having a high-resolution VR, AR experience with somebody is just tremendous, and forecasting out 5 years or 10 years. It's not inconceivable to think that medical students of the future will be able to try out in a virtual environment things like surgery, just so they can train themselves without in that kind of environment. So it's really, I think the sky's the limit. We just want to set the table for all of that innovation to happen. So whether it's mid-band spectrum, low-band spectrum, or even high-band spectrum, we want to get as much out there for commercial innovators to use, and the next generation of Wi-Fi as well, whatever it is. We can't tell, but we know it's going to be big. I just hope I'm around to see all this innovation. I've got to say, for someone who grew up as I did in rural Kansas in the 70s and 80s, when it was 3 broadcast channels and a big clunky phone wired into the wall, it just blows my mind that my kids are growing up in an era where everything is connected, from your refrigerator to your washing machine to, it's amazing.
Mr. Chairman, to your left.
Hey.
Yes, with FCC. So what do you see as the role of the company, the level?
That's a great question. As I often say, one of the great things about the internet age is that we're all connected. One of the downsides is that we're all connected, and cybersecurity is an increasingly important issue. We regularly get classified briefings at the agency on some of the threats that we're seeing, and that is one of the issues that I do see as very, very important. Under the existing law, Congress has given the Department of Homeland Security the lead role in specifying cybersecurity practices, but we do consult with them regularly and consult with them as necessary on the technical aspects of how networks operate. And in addition to that, we've worked with other federal agencies to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of the priority that we assign to this issue. So going forward, I think Congress and the administration have some serious choices to make. These attacks are growing ever more sophisticated, and I think it's incumbent upon policymakers, regulators, elected officials, and alike to figure out the right way forward.
How does that impact?
It's a good question. So typically speaking, under the law, we have relatively circumscribed jurisdiction over cybersecurity. Under certain parts of the Communications Act, we don't have broad-ranging ability to prescribe rules, cybersecurity rules. It's more of a consultative role with DHS. So it is something we think about a lot, and there are many issues which I can't talk about for obvious reasons, where we are collaborating with the private sector and with public sector agencies. But we don't have a formal regulatory role under existing law.
Mr. Chairman, we have our county manager with us who
Okay.
was a victim of crypto ransom. Was it a year ago?
Is that right?
Anything about that experience you'd like to share? It was such a wonderful week for you, we know.
It's only being live streamed on Facebook. I'm sure nobody's watching, so don't, yeah. Right. Yeah, it makes it profitable for that to happen ultimately. Right. I can imagine.
We are very proud of the position and the way Mecklenburg County handled that.
Yeah.
That was in the national news, so I didn't bring up anything that's a secret locally. A last question. Yes, sir. Chris.
Hey. That's a great question. So we don't have a formal role in terms of the ethics of artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other types of advanced technologies. Nonetheless, I spend a lot of time thinking about AI and machine learning. I think of all the technologies we've talked about, blockchain and IoT and the like, I actually think machine learning is going to be one of the most transformative. And I've had the chance to meet over the last several months with a number of experts who've talked about where they see the marketplace going. And it's incredible to think about how much disruption it's going to have, positive and negative. And I think from our perspective, I leave it to the experts, like the folks at Harvard or Bank of America or wherever, to sort through the ethics of it. As I think about the practical impact of it, that's something I think I'm very interested in exploring at the FCC. For example, some of the things that people think about when they think of AI involve automation of jobs that traditionally have been done by people. And so, for example, what if you were a long-haul trucker or a pharmacist or even a young lawyer, and you see a lot of these things being automated in 10 to 20 years? Even right now, a lot of those professions are being automated. You can imagine driverless trucks going across the country, a pharmacist being displaced by an algorithm essentially that gives the exact proportions of a drug that otherwise you would be in charge of putting together, or even lawyers. Software can now crunch through 1 million documents and find the most salient ones and synthesize them in a way that you would have taken many hours to do previously. So I think trying to engage in a conversation with the American people about how artificial intelligence and machine learning will impact the economy would be great. And also talk about the positive effects too. And I think there are many very salutary outcomes for machine learning that deserve focus too. One of the most impressive, I did recently a call with a company that's investing a lot of time in AI, and they showed me how they fed this series of algorithms an entire feature-length movie, and somehow the algorithm figured out what the most important scenes were from the movie, came up with a 60-second preview, all together with the voice that we all know from the movie previews, and they showed it to me, and it was seamless. You would never know that this was all generated by a computer. So it's exciting, some of the stuff that's on tap. Will free us up to do other types of productive activities, but I think we do need to have a very robust conversation with the American people, and that's something I hope the FCC is able to do.
One last question.
Okay.
Only because you brought it up.
Oh, man.
Duke or Carolina?
Oh, I mean, look, civilization or anarchy. I mean, of course I choose UNC. There's no doubt about it. It's like, yeah. No, and I always say this. It's whenever, and I have many good friends who go to Duke. We're friends nonetheless, but I still hold bitterness in my heart from the 1986 Final Four. When that team Kansas had was just spectacular, and to watch Johnny Dawkins and all those guys take down our team was just tremendous. And over the years, I mean, my God, Christian Laettner, Bobby Hurley, Wojo, Grayson Allen. I mean, my God, how do they find these? Like, how can you not? I mean, it's great education, all that kind of stuff. But my God, that basketball team just drives me crazy. It's just, I mean, part of it is envy. I'll say, I'm one of the most successful and storied programs in the world. But I was always much more favorable to North Carolina, and also that Kansas-North Carolina symbiosis. Dean Smith and Roy Williams, and actually Bill Guthridge, who was the coach at UNC, came from my hometown, Parsons, Kansas. Parsons High School graduate from 1955. So I've always had a soft spot in my heart for Chapel Hill.
Tark, now he's my hero. That was out of the ballpark.
And apologies to all the Duke folks out there. I don't mean to.
Have you done one of these tours in Lexington, Kentucky?
Right.
They dislike Duke almost as much as some of us in North Carolina.
I mean, you remember those Kentucky Duke battles in the 90s? It was incredible. You can still see Scott Padgett, I think it was, shooting a three in 98. One of the things that drives my wife crazy. Like, how can you remember the final in 1988 when Kansas beat Oklahoma was 83-79? You can't remember, like, Sunday night is when the garbage is supposed to be taken out. The amount of useless minutia that is crammed in my head is just mind-boggling.
Have your wife call mine when she wants to ask that
exactly
question.
right.
She can relate. thank you very much. I'm going to repeat it again. Your enthusiasm for these issues, for the job.
Oh, thank you.
Very impressive, and thank you for taking the time to be with us.
Thanks for having me.
I don't know if you're able to stick around to talk to folks individually afterwards.
I'll defer to, I think so, right?
Do we have a few minutes? And then I want to put in a couple of quick plugs. So the short session of the legislature began last week, and so far it looks to be, it's a short session, going to be largely uneventful, we think, so far. Come in and tweak the budget. They're going to try to get out by mid to late June, certainly early July. That's probably going to happen. Joe Bost and Keith Kelly are the public policy guys for the Charlotte Chamber of Commerce. They are your resource to help keep track of what's happening in Raleigh as we are promoting a pro-business, pro-Charlotte agenda. Let them know what your issues are that they can help keep an eye out for as well.